Well, good evening again. We'll just set the scene from John chapter 6, the closing verses of that chapter. Jesus had been speaking in the synagogue in Capernaum, and verse 60 goes on to say, "Many, therefore, of his disciples, when they heard this, said, 'This is a difficult statement. Who can listen to it?' But Jesus, conscious that his disciples grumbled at this, said to them, 'Does this cause you to stumble? What then if you should behold the Son of Man ascending where he was before? It is the Spirit who gives life. The flesh profits nothing. The words that I have spoken to you are spirit and are life. But there are some of you who do not believe,' because Jesus knew from the beginning who they were who did not believe and who it was that would betray him. And he was saying, 'For this reason I have said to you that no one can come to me unless it has been granted him from the Father.' Now as a result of this, many of his disciples withdrew and were not walking with him anymore. Jesus said therefore to the 12 apostles, 'You do not want to go away also, do you?' Simon Peter answered him, 'Lord, to whom else shall we go? You have the words of eternal life, and we have believed and have come to know that you are the Holy One of God.' Jesus answered them, 'Did I myself not choose you, the 12? And yet one of you is a devil.' Now he meant Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, for he, one of the 12, was going to betray him." So here was Jesus in Galilee, in the synagogue at Capernaum, just the day after he had fed the 5,000 with loaves and fishes, and 12 hours or so after the night that he walked on the water. Now, because having read that, we've got the scene that shows the beginning of Jesus, what is called Jesus' year of unpopularity. Jesus replied to Jesus had told the Jews not to grumble back at verse 43 of John 6, but they had kept at it. And halfway through Jesus' discourse in the synagogue, the Jews seemed to have divided into two groups: those who were perplexed and questioning what they were hearing, and those, on the other hand, who were hostile and contemptuous of what they were hearing. By the end of Jesus' discourse, there were hardly any who were not angry or offended in some way. And Jesus' reply to his offended disciples, as we've just read, was to assure them that they must not take his words concerning the flesh literally. He told them that the flesh is of no profit. At verse 62, he seemed to allude to the fact that his own flesh would one day descend to the grave. That's verse 62, where he says, "What then if you should behold the Son of Man ascending where he was before?" Now, whether this means descending into the earth and then rising back resurrected, or whether he meant ascending to heaven, we could argue that point. So instead, he told them that they must value the things of the Spirit. And he seemed to be saying that if they did not do that, then the time would come when they would be offended by Jesus' own ascension from the grave in a new spiritual nature. At verse 64, Jesus knew that by now many of his disciples refused to believe his words, and verse 66 tells us that these former disciples decided to leave Jesus. Now, this is not to suggest that all of the 5,000 men and more women and children who had been fed miraculously the day before had all been Jesus' disciples, but that might have been the connotation. There may have been this massive exodus from him that very day of most of those people. We can be sure one way or the other that those people that left they ended up occupying themselves with the traditional business of journeying to Jerusalem for Passover, because this was the time of year. Jesus realized that the allurement of the Passover festival, which entailed going to Jerusalem and to the temple, of course, the allurement of that and Judaism itself and the peer pressure from their fellow Jews was a strong temptation, not only to the other disciples but to the 12 apostles as well. On the lake, through the night, Jesus had challenged the apostles to see whether or not they would draw near to him or keep their distance. And now, here at the Capernaum synagogue, he challenged them again. And as we saw, it was Simon Peter who answered, "Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life." And he asserted, "We have believed, we have come to know that you are the Holy One of God." Is it not interesting and significant that twice in one day it was Peter who is recorded to have had the strength of character to reaffirm his faith and loyalty toward Jesus in the company of the other apostles? It was he on the boat in the night who said, "If that is you, Lord, beckon me to walk out onto the water with you." And Jesus was willing to do that. It was Peter alone who was willing to show that much faith. And so here again, he is the one that steps forward to assert his faith, not only on his behalf, but on the behalf of his fellow disciples. I really believe that all of them, the 12, were struggling at this time. Peter's reply was not only a confession of his own faith, but also an attempt to bolster the faith of the others, as if to remind them of what they had experienced and what they had learned of Jesus over the past 2 or more years. The reason I suggested it was to bolster their faith is that Jesus recognized a bad attitude in Judas Iscariot that the Lord knew would eventually cause Judas to turn traitor. And yet a plain reading indicates that the other apostles were none the wiser. There was nothing about Judas at this stage, not his speech or his countenance or his behavior, that had distinguished him from the others. And so Peter was describing all of the apostles, including Judas, when he said, "We believe, we know, you definitely are our Lord." He didn't know that Judas was in unbelief. If Judas had been questioning or grumbling at this time, then sadly he was evidently not the only apostle to be doing so. Peter could sort of describe them all as a bunch, and I don't suggest that Judas was necessarily questioning or grumbling at all behind the scenes with the others, but if he was, then so were the others. There was this camaraderie between them that Peter thought they were all on the same on the same boat, as it were. It's important for us to recall that this was a very busy day in Jesus' ministry, and it was also a milestone, as it were. It was a turning point with many different incidents and events and periods of teaching, all interweaved by the gospel writers. Now, earlier in the day, there had been the discussion about defilement, and we return to that occasion now. Jesus had left Capernaum that evening and retreated to Bethsaida, I believe. The 12 apostles followed him, but were probably still very somber and perplexed, maybe even irritated or troubled by the day's events at the synagogue. They had a lot to think about, but among other things, they were still unclear about Jesus' comments about the traditions of the elders, which had taken place before Jesus had arrived at the Capernaum synagogue. We'll go back into Mark's Gospel to pick up that point. Mark, of course, doesn't relate the time that they spent in the synagogue. He simply describes this particular lesson in one piece. But the earlier part was before the Capernaum synagogue, and the next part, from Mark 7 verse 17 onward, it was evidently after the occasion of the synagogue discourse. So Mark 7 verse 17, I'll just recount that earlier, back at verse 14 through 16, Jesus had called the multitude to himself after he'd been accused by the Pharisees of uncleanness. He began saying to them, "Listen to me, all of you, and understand." That is, his disciples, the multitudes, and the Pharisees as well, the scribes and Pharisees. All listen to me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside the man which going into him can defile him. But the things which proceed out of the man are what defile the man. If any man has ears to hear, let him hear. And now I believe the discourse at the Capernaum synagogue should be inserted between verse 16 and now verse 17. When leaving the multitude, which is to say, leaving the multitude that had started to desert Jesus, Jesus had entered the house, and his disciples questioned him about the parable. And he said to them, "Are you so lacking in understanding also? Do you not understand that whatever goes into the man from outside of the man cannot defile him, because it does not go into his heart, but into his stomach, and is then eliminated, or discarded?" Literally, he was saying it goes out into the latrine. And thus, Mark says, Jesus declared all foods clean. And Jesus was also saying, that which proceeds out of the man, that is what defiles the man. We'll pick up on those verses shortly. So the fact that having left the multitude, he entered the house and his disciples questioned him, this goes to show how important the traditions of the elders were to the apostles and how radical or strange Jesus' teaching concerning true defilement seemed to be to them. It was so strange that they could not take Jesus' words seriously or literally from the earlier occasion, and they were thinking to themselves, he must have been speaking a parable. And so they decided, as I say, that he must have been speaking parabolically or figuratively, just as he had concerning bread and flesh and blood. I could well imagine Jesus was rather vexed at their incomprehension and by their concern about the vain traditions of the elders. I could believe Jesus resented the insinuation that he had been speaking riddles as well. Verses 18 through 19, he asked them, "Are you so lacking in understanding? Do you not understand? The defilement comes from within." To get some idea how difficult it was for the apostles to comprehend and accept this idea, just read Acts chapter 10 sometime, or Galatians 2, which both indicate that the apostle Peter was still so conscious and so sensitive to the Jewish traditions of purification, as much as 4 and then 15 years after this particular day. It just goes to show what a strong inclination it was to regard defilement as something that comes from outside of oneself. Jesus knew that all the apostles were beset at this time with wrong thoughts and feelings and attitudes, not just Judas, but all 12 of them. He wanted them to realize that it was inside their minds and hearts that they would either be acceptable or unacceptable to God. It is inside their minds and hearts that they actually fellowship with God. So verses 20 through 23, he was saying, that which proceeds out of the man is that which defiles the man. For from within him, out of the heart proceed the evil thoughts, fornications, thefts, murders, adulteries, deeds of coveting and wickedness, as well as deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, and foolishness. All of which, we could occupy an evening on each of these sins. But Jesus summarizes by saying at verse 23, all these evil things proceed from within the man, within the person, and they defile him. Now, after these things, Jesus remained walking in Galilee because he was unwilling to walk in Judea, according to John 7 verse 1. He was unwilling to walk in Judea, that is to go back to Jerusalem and to the temple, because the Jews were seeking to kill him. Remember, this is Passover, and Jesus may have known that it would have been on the occasion of Passover that he would be slain, but this was not that particular occasion. But he stayed in Galilee not only to protect himself, but besides protecting himself and the apostles from the hostility at Jerusalem, this was also a time to wean the apostles off the ceremonies of the law. So we've seen how that the clash between Jesus and the people had been so severe that Jesus had come close to publicly condemning the Jewish leaders. The synagogue rulers had become highly offended at Jesus. Many of Jesus' long-standing disciples, that is to say Jewish disciples, quickly deserted him. And there was even some ill feeling or resentment from the apostles. And this clash had been inevitable sooner or later, because Jesus had all the time been setting standards and priorities of discipleship which the people kept refusing to face up to or to agree to. So when the Jews challenged those standards and priorities which Jesus was continually enunciating, those moral demands, those devotional demands from each individual, and Jesus did not compromise them, then the people suddenly saw how incompatible their two positions actually were. Three of the major effects of the confrontation in the Capernaum synagogue were: 1, the need to restore and strengthen the apostles' faith in Jesus himself aside from Judaism. Secondly, the renewed commitment by the Jewish leaders to kill Jesus. And third, the end of Jesus' public ministry to the synagogues in Galilee. I stand to be corrected, but I think that this incident in Capernaum was the last time that Jesus ministered in any of the synagogues in Galilee. Now, in the law of Moses, God had stipulated that each year all the Jewish men must attend 3 specific feasts at the place which God chose. That's written in Deuteronomy 16, verse 16. Now, I suspect, but I cannot be sure, that Jesus had fulfilled this obligation so far during his 2-year ministry. In fact, I believe we might even be able to identify all these occasions, although not with complete certainty. There would have been 2 Passovers in early spring. One was John chapter 2 verse 23. The other was most likely John chapter 5 verse 1. There were 2 Feasts of Weeks. We sometimes refer to that as Pentecost. But that was in late spring, 7 weeks after Passover. We might perceive that in John chapter 3 verse 22 and Luke chapter 6 verse 1. And there were also 2 Feasts of Tabernacles, which is to say 2 Feasts of Booths or Ingathering, which is in early autumn. Now, there's a reference to that in John's Gospel, definitely, but also maybe Luke chapter 5 verse 12 and chapter 7 verse 36. But now, at the beginning of Jesus' 3rd year of ministry, even though the Passover festival in Jerusalem was only days away, John chapter 7 verse 1 tells us about after the confrontation with the Jews, Jesus remained in Galilee, for he would not walk in Judea because the Jews were seeking to kill him. Now Jesus knew that one day he would have to be arrested by the Jewish leaders and then killed, all in obedience to God's will. But he also knew that this was not the time for his ultimate sacrifice. And it may be that Jesus even knew what day his death would be from some of the Old Testament scriptures. He would have known that to expose himself to the threat of death in Jerusalem just now was a risk that God did not wish for him to take. Jesus' decision to forego the Passover festival would have created a quandary, though, or a tension in the minds of the apostles, who, every year had attended the festivals, being good, faithful Jews, and now they were being asked to not attend. Well, during the last day or two, as we've seen, they'd been perplexed and challenged at the difference between their expectations of Jesus and his more radical teachings and demands. Now Jesus was calling them away from their traditional God-given religious obligation at Jerusalem. So we have to be impressed by the resilience and devotion of these apostles, that they chose to identify with Jesus and chose to stay with him. Mark chapter 7 verse 24 suggests that Jesus remained in the house at Bethsaida for a brief time and then stood up to embark on a new phase of ministry. And of course this phase of ministry was going to be a school, a learning environment for the apostles. So we read at Mark 7 verse 24, "And from there Jesus arose and went away to the region of Tyre and Sidon. And when he had entered a house, he wanted no one to know of it, yet he could not escape notice." Now in the news recently, there's a lot of news coming back and forth about the interaction between Israel's army and the people of southern Lebanon. And this is the region where Jesus has now gone, the region of Tyre and Sidon. So this was now the second time since John the Baptist's death that Jesus had tried to spend time alone with his apostles. He evidently needed to discuss and explain things to them in private. So they retreated some 30 to 40 kilometers northwest to the borderland by Phoenicia, where they knew of a house which was vacated during the Passover season. This would be something like us all going on retreat up to, Pipariki or somewhere like that, out into the upper reaches of the Wanganui River. So they've gone there during the Passover season, which it's into a house which maybe belonged to one of the apostles' relatives. But as usual, the group was recognized by some local person. Appreciate that people had come to Jesus in the past from the hinterland around Israel. They had come from as far as the Lebanon and from Syria. So there was evidently some people that recognized him. And the report of the group's whereabouts soon spread around the region. Across the border in Phoenicia, a Canaanite woman of mixed Syrian-Phoenician nationality had heard that the Jewish miracle worker from Galilee was very close to her homeland. She was desperate for a cure for her little daughter. So she immediately went in search of Jesus and crossed into northern Galilee. Meanwhile, Jesus had decided to make a move across the border to leave Israel and Judaism and to find refuge in Phoenicia for a time. He would not have made this move lightly or casually, because it meant another difficult challenge to the apostles. As staunch Jews, the apostles had scruples about spiritual defilement caused by contact with Gentiles. They regarded them as dirty and lesser beings. This indicates how serious Jesus regarded the threat or hindrance that was posed by the Jews at this time. It was while Jesus and the apostles were on the move toward Phoenicia that we read from Matthew 15, verses 22 to 24. Behold, a Canaanite woman came out from that region and began to cry out, saying, "Have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David. My daughter is cruelly demon-possessed." But Jesus did not answer her a word. And his disciples came to him and kept asking him, saying, "Send her away, for she is shouting out after us." But he answered them and said, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." Now at this stage, Jesus and the apostles kept on walking, with Jesus evidently somewhat ahead, possibly far ahead, and the poor woman was doing her best to keep up with them. Matthew indicates that the apostles asked Jesus several times to send her away. So this must have continued for quite some time, maybe even more than an hour, more than a couple of hours. While the woman trailed behind the group, the apostles would have assumed and accepted that Jesus would not help her because she was a Gentile and not one of what Jesus referred to as the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And as with the multitudes just before the miracle of the loaves and fishes, the apostles' desire to send this woman away was because they thought her well-being was not their concern. They thought that, all right, it's a need, but it's not something to do, nothing to do with us. However, Jesus had not said that. And whereas he deferred her request, he did not actually rebuff or refuse her. We have to be impressed by her tenacity and resilience now. She might have despaired from exhaustion and disappointment, but instead she made her most determined effort to bypass the apostles and catch up with Jesus himself and to get an answer from him directly. Mark 7 verse 25 says she came and fell at his feet. So we read now from verses 25 through 26 of Matthew 15. She came and began to bow down before him, saying, "Lord, help me." And he answered and said, "It is not good to take the children's bread and to throw it to the dogs." That Greek word for dogs is actually puppies. So not only is he referring to her people as animals, but he's also diminishing, giving her a diminutive, making her something smaller again. Now, Mark's Gospel at chapter 7 verse 27 adds that Jesus was saying to her, "Let the children be satisfied first." And that continuous tense suggests that he said this repeatedly. So it says that she began to bow down before him, and the picture in my mind's eye is that he continues to keep walking past her or beyond her, and she keeps running over to him and bowing down repeatedly. So we can picture. So at this stage, Jesus seems to have persisted for some time in deferring the woman's pleading. And I believe we can picture the woman on the ground, on her hands and knees, trying to stay in front of Jesus while he repeatedly steps past her. Now, the Jews think of her as a dog. Jesus himself referred to her in the same terms, and she is aware that she now looks like a dog on all fours at Jesus' feet. But then, without any hint of bitterness or resentment for being slighted or demeaned, the woman gave a reply that revealed that she understood and humbly accepted Jesus' words. She said, "Yes, Lord, because even the dogs under the table feed on the children's crumbs which fall from their master's table." Here, in one sentence, she revealed her belief that the Jews had priority of fellowship and blessing from their relationship with their Lord, while that the Gentiles, herself included, could enjoy the same benefits on a secondary basis by being in the Israelite household. Like a pet puppy, she knew that she was in a different relationship to Christ, a different relationship to the God of Israel than the children of Israel themselves were. But like a pet puppy, she could still expect to receive through the Jews at least a morsel, just a little of the abundance which God had granted them. The only Jews in the vicinity besides Jesus were the apostles. So his reference to lost sheep and to children probably referred specifically to these 12, even if they didn't catch the insinuation at this time. It is possible to infer that this Gentile woman understood that the morsel she requested should have been satisfied by the apostles. In that case, her insight was an indictment on the apostles because it showed up their own lack of perception. If Jesus had been vexed and unhappy about the apostles' mental and spiritual dullness, then the conviction and courage of this Syrophoenician woman must have been a great delight and refreshment to him. Jesus' face, I imagine, must have shown his great admiration and affection for this woman as he said to her, "Oh woman, your faith is great. Because of this answer, you go your way and be it done for you as you wish. The demon has gone out of your daughter." And there's no hint of sort of sternness or rigidity in Jesus. Saying, "Oh woman," I can almost imagine him giving a laugh because of his delight at her faithfulness. It is possible that to prove to the apostles that the power of God had entered the Gentile home of this woman and healed a Gentile child, Jesus might have gone to the Syrophoenician woman's home. I would like to think so. But whether or not this happened, it seems clear from Mark 7 verse 31 that Jesus continued to travel further into Phoenicia, at least as far as Sidon, 50 kilometers north of Galilee, so that he and the apostles were deep in Gentile territory, where he could teach them to put away their Jewish biases and their Jewish scruples. This was not a missionary journey to the Gentiles per se. That might have been a secondary effect of it. Primarily, it was a retreat from the influence of Judaism in Israel, so that Jesus could spend more time with his apostles without hindrances or restrictions or distractions from those that opposed his ministry. Coming back into Mark 7 at verse 31, Mark 7 verse 31, just after Mark has recounted the same incident with the Syrophoenician woman. Verse 31 says, "Again Jesus went out from the region of Tyre and came through Sidon back to the Sea of Galilee within the region of Decapolis." Now Decapolis was east of the Sea of Galilee, so Jesus has done quite a major circuit on this occasion. This circuit through the borderlands might have been as much as 200 kilometres. It is reasonable to suggest that it occupied perhaps 2 months, covering the period from Passover through to the end of the Feast of Weeks or Pentecost. Although Jesus intended this to be a private retreat with his apostles, people who recognized him near Galilee came to him in their hundreds and thousands and followed him for several days. Again, like the Syrophoenician woman, these multitudes were Gentiles, or at least part Gentiles. And again, just like before, Jesus did not immediately minister to them. Again, like that Syrophoenician woman, these multitudes must have refused to give up hope in Jesus. They continued to follow determinedly and desperately until they were almost exhausted. Matthew 15 verse 30 says that the able-bodied were carrying many of the needy ones, people who were blind or crippled or paralyzed or even amputees. And after Jesus stopped at the hillside, then the able-bodied ones cast the invalids down on the ground beside him. Not suggesting that they threw them there, but they put them down, almost dropping them, I imagine, out of sheer exhaustion. As the thousands of Gentiles watched the healings performed by this Jewish preacher, they marveled at the compassion and power that he ministered in the name of his God, the God of the Jews. And Matthew says they glorified the God of Israel. It's that reference to glorifying the God of Israel which implies, from which we can reasonably infer, that these were not Israelites. These were Gentiles. These were folk of other nations. We saw that a year earlier there were hints of the effect that Jesus' ministry would eventually have on the Gentiles. Matthew 12 verse 21 quotes Isaiah 42 verse 3, saying that in his name the Gentiles will hope. They will put their hope in the Messiah of the Israelites. But back then, back at Matthew 12 verse 21, most of those Gentiles were converts of Judaism, whereas now the apostles are faced with their Jewish Messiah reaching out, touching and ministering to the despised pagan Gentiles. I wonder if the apostles felt like glorifying the God of Israel at that time, even as these Gentiles were doing it. Mark 7 verses 32 to 37 read like this. They, that is these Gentiles, brought to him one who was deaf and spoke with difficulty, and they entreated him to lay his hand upon him. And he took him aside from the multitude by himself, and put his fingers into his ears, and after spitting, he touched his tongue with the saliva. So Jesus spat on his fingers, and he touched this person's tongue. And looking up to heaven with a deep sigh, he said to him, Ephphatha, that is, be opened. Ephphatha would have been an Aramaic or Hebrew term, so it means be opened, and he's referring to his ears, the deafness there. And the man's ears were opened, and the impediment of his tongue was removed, and he began speaking plainly. And he gave the people orders not to tell anyone, but the more he ordered them, the more widely they continued to proclaim it. And they were utterly astonished, saying, He has done all things well. He makes even the deaf to hear and the dumb to speak. Now this miracle was quite extraordinary in that it was particularly elaborate. The Gospels record something similar when Jesus sent the blind man to the pool of Bethsaida, but this one was even more elaborate. It has some significant features that will reappear later. Jesus performed the miracle only in the presence of the apostles. Jesus also spat, and he sighed or groaned audibly. Also, he ordered that the miracle be kept secret or private. The fact that Mark refers to these features again in the next few paragraphs might help to suggest the significance of this miracle. So we have a look at Mark 8, chapter 8, verses 1 through 4. It says, In those days again, when there was a great multitude and they had nothing to eat, he called his disciples and said to them, I feel compassion for the multitude because they have remained with me now for 3 days and they have nothing to eat. And if I send them away hungry to their home, they will faint on the way. And some of them have come from a great distance. And his disciples answered him, where will anyone be able to find enough to satisfy these men with bread here in a desolate place? Now the reply of the apostles was rather strange. Matthew 15 verse 33 records them as saying, "Where would we get so many loaves in a desolate place to satisfy such a great multitude?" Well, just a couple of months ago, just north of here on the same lake shore, the apostles had witnessed the miracle of the loaves and fishes. Had they already forgotten all about that? Or did they imagine that Jesus could not or would not perform the same miracle? I'm not sure, but I don't think so. I might be mistaken, but I cannot interpret their reaction as anything other than a stalling tactic based on a negative or evil attitude. I suggest the apostles replied out of a somewhat sullen or sulky or niggardly attitude, which resented the attention Jesus had been giving to these Gentiles. Jesus spoke to the apostles of his compassion and consideration for these people who were, as he says, with him, people identified with him, as it were. Now we saw how offended and upset they were with this one woman who was following after them. How must they have felt by this huge crowd of people whom they considered unclean and ungodly? But Jesus wished for the apostles to join him in the same attitude toward these Gentiles that he had. And as I say, this whole circuit around Galilee and into the hinterland was a teaching opportunity. Jesus' words were the cue for the apostles to recognize their opportunity, not to repulse these people or to hinder them, but to serve them from their own means by giving what God had given to them, just as Jesus had tried to teach them by the earlier miracle of the loaves and fishes, which had been done for Jewish people. Jesus knew the apostles had bread which they could share, but their first reply evaded that fact. Worse than that, their reply was virtually a snub or a rebuff to Jesus' request. The evasiveness or reticence of the apostles also seems to show up at Mark chapter 8 verse 5, which reads, "He was asking them, 'How many loaves do you have?'" The continuous tense suggests that Jesus had to ask them more than once. They didn't answer him immediately. If the apostles still felt that it was not good to take their bread and throw it to the dogs, as Jesus had said earlier to the Syrophoenician woman, they nevertheless ended up obeying Jesus' command. They did admit that they had 7 loaves with them. So a second miraculous feeding was performed, and we read at Mark 8 verses 8 through 9, "And they ate and were satisfied." I should go into verses 6 through 7 to begin with, shouldn't I? "Jesus directed the multitude to sit down on the ground, and taking the 7 loaves, he gave thanks and broke them and started giving them to his disciples to serve to them, and they served them to the multitude. They also had a few small fish, and after Jesus had blessed them, he ordered these to be served as well." And so from verses 8 through 9, the multitude ate and were satisfied, and they picked up 7 large baskets full of what was left over of the broken pieces. And about 4,000 people were there, and Jesus then sent them away. Now the baskets referred to there, these baskets of scraps, were not small one-man hampers this time as they had been in Galilee at the first feeding of the multitude. These baskets were more like large bassinets or crates or trunks. They were what many of the invalids had been carried in before they were healed. Now Mark 8 verse 10 says, "Jesus immediately entered the boat with his disciples and came to the district of Dalmanutha. Now, unfortunately, we're entering a very long section here without any breaks, so I decided that I'd probably stop at that point, and we'll pick up hopefully where we left off tonight next time I speak, God willing.